So this video is the second part in a two-part series on planning out your garden pad. If you haven't watched the first video, be sure to check it out. So whether or not you're going to garden in a raised bed or in ground is a pretty big consideration. I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer here. I just think it's what is easiest for you. I opted for raised beds primarily because it's just easier for me to optimize the soil that I'm going to need, both in terms of the consistency or the makeup of the soil. I have very heavy clay soil, which can be very difficult to garden with because it's hard, doesn't drain very well, but also in terms of nutrients. And so you can really tailor what you want for your plants by creating, it's just like a giant container garden essentially. And so in-ground gardening is an excellent option. I don't have a ton of experience with that, but that is a huge question you're going to have to ask yourself, because raised beds do mean something else you're going to have to purchase and maintain. If you're going to do raised garden beds, you'll have to consider the material you are going to use. And there's a lot of really great options out there. This is cedar, there's treated lumber, there are things like cinder block, steel, and so on. I think the biggest things you'll want to consider is, number one, the maintenance requirements of whatever material you're going to use. I mean, wood will eventually rot. And then number two, is the material going to leach unwanted additives into your garden soil? And for something that you're going to be eating, a vegetable garden, that may not be something you really are wanting. So watch out for treated lumber or painted things. Those might have some chemicals or additives that you're not really wanting in your soil. So the next type of raised garden bed I want to talk about is one called a keyhole garden. And a keyhole garden is essentially a waist-high raised bed that can be made out of many different materials, but really the purpose of it is sort of twofold. Number one is that it does retain moisture better than the standard raised bed, and number two, there's a central composting bin that you water, and that diffuses nutrients out to the soil. So for those areas that are really water restricted, or there's very limited access to things like fertilizer, this is a really great option for them. And where these are used a lot, or where I've seen them used a lot, is in places like South Africa. I do have a helpful video on keyhole gardens, but there is a fellow Texan, her name is Dr. Deb Tolman, and she is a wealth of knowledge on this particular style of garden bed. Another consideration you need to have if you're going to do raised beds or even in ground beds is the spacing. You want to make sure that you have easy access to all plants in your garden space. And so at least when it comes to raised beds, that means you don't want to have a bed that's so wide you can't access those middle plants. Also, if you're really struggling with bending over or kneeling or stooping, it's not my particular favorite, consider getting taller raised beds, because that might save your back. I have found it easier to start small and to build from there. So my first year in this area, I had 2 by 6 feet raised beds, and then just this last year I put in a 4 by 6 bed, and maybe next year I'll add another bed. But I think it's, starting small and building as you go is a great way to gain experience without feeling overwhelmed, and without being really wasteful. All right, so as a gardener, you are likely accumulating extra vegetative material and used soil, and having a compost pile or a composting area is a great way to recycle those items. A couple of things to consider in terms of locating your compost area, compost pile. One is you want to make sure that it is in a well-draining area. You don't want this sitting directly in water or standing water. Number two is you want to make sure that your compost material is not in direct contact with important structures like the side of your home or your fence, because with time it can degrade those structures. In terms of whether or not to create a bin or have some form of enclosure for your pile, I think that's strictly up to you. It does help keep it a little tidier, and there are prefabricated options out there. This essentially is retaining wall stone that I just shaped into a U type of enclosure, and then here through the middle I just created a barrier so that it separated it into two piles. And how I compost is I usually drop material on one side, cover it with dirt from the other side, and then when one side fills, I start going the opposite direction. You can also just fill one side up, little by little, and let it completely fill, and when it does, then start working on the other side. So lots of different ways to do it, but this is sort of my setup here. I do have a helpful video on this as well. So next thing I'm going to discuss is a greenhouse. And as a gardener, you might feel like a greenhouse is sort of next level gardening, and that it's like the ultimate garden accessory, but I'm going to tell you I'm not convinced it is. They're very handy. I have overwintered a lot of things in my greenhouse. However, there are some maintenance issues that I have encountered, and I don't know if you're looking in the background, if you can kind of see some of that, and I'll show you up close here in a moment. But if you do decide to get a greenhouse, the first thing you're going to want to consider is the R value, or the insulation quality of the greenhouse. Most residential greenhouses are made with either plastic sheeting or polycarbonate panels. And you want to make sure that if you are utilizing something with polycarbonate panels, that you consider the maintenance, because let's go look at this. All right, so here is inside my greenhouse. All right, boop, I've got a totally blown out panel here, and then you can see all of the holes that I've tried to patch up, but there's just some of this you're not going to patch up, and you hear all that creaking. This panel's trying to give up the ghost, but I'm trying to hang on for dear life. But this is my third season with this particular greenhouse, and between, like I said, the hail and the UV radiation from the sun, it is just not really held up well. And so I'm sure there are better quality polycarbonate panels and things like that out there, but I just can't afford to continue replacing these panels or buy a new greenhouse. And sometimes replacing the panels is just as expensive or than to replace the entire greenhouse, or trying to put these panels back in, or new panels back in, is just, you have to take the whole thing apart. And so something to consider if you're going to get a greenhouse. I think my next investment is going to be a hoop house with plastic sheeting that I can roll up during the summer on the sides. I don't know. Now you might be like, well, Natalie, I need a greenhouse because I have to start seeds, or I want to overwinter things. And really you can do that in your home if you've got the space for that, to include starting seeds. I did start seeds in my greenhouse late winter, and to be honest with you, it was very difficult to regulate the temperatures in there to really give the seeds and seedlings what they wanted. And I don't know that they really grew to their full potential as compared to maybe growing them indoors with grow lights and a heat mat. So don't think you got to get a greenhouse to start seeds or overwinter. You can really do that indoors, even in a garage with a space heater and some grow lights. So just something to consider. So in this last segment, I wanted to discuss drawing in pollinators to your garden area and preventing pests, which I think is very important. And there are some things that you can do and plan ahead to facilitate that process. It's obviously a very big topic, so I'll keep it brief. In regard to drawing in pollinators, one of the best ways you can do that is by planting just some decorative or native flowers in your garden area. Another thing you can do is plant specific host plants to draw in a particular type of pollinator. Some people do this with milkweed and monarch butterflies, or fennel and dill with certain types of, I think, swallowtail butterflies. And then the last thing you could do is you can put up a bee house for our native bees. And I didn't realize this, but native bees do the lion's share of our pollination, and they are solitary, so they don't work in a hive. And putting up a bee house will potentially help their life cycle along. I've got a small short on mason bees. If you're interested in that, you can check that out. In terms of prevention of pests, there's several ways you can do that. We're either talking mechanical prevention, like with cages or netting or some sort of protective barrier, or we're talking chemical prevention. And when it comes to chemical prevention, we're talking either organic or non-organic. And I know non-organic options are very effective, but they're somewhat controversial. There's some very great organic options out there. However, just because it's organic doesn't mean these options may not have some unintended effects. Specifically, I currently have an aphid problem on my cucumber plants, and I did use some diatomaceous earth on them, which is meant to be lethal to any insect with an exoskeleton, which is great if to get rid of the aphids, but not so great if you're trying to preserve beneficial insects like lacewings or ladybugs. So you have to use it sparingly. Also, I use BT on my kale to prevent the worms, the cabbage worms and things that like to eat those up. But BT is toxic to butterflies and moths, and so if you're trying to draw in butterflies and moths, it's probably not something you're going to want to use as widely in your garden, if at all. So do consider that as well. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, found it helpful. If so, do consider subscribing and liking, and y'all take care.